Welcome, fellow chill seekers, to Lady Grimm, where the veil between our world and the unknown grows thin. I am your guide through these chilling tales, your mistress of mystery, the one who weaves nightmares into haunting words. I am the Lady Grimm, and I bid you a bone-chilling welcome. In the depths of darkness, we gather each week to explore the realms of the paranormal, where things that go bump in the night come alive, and the line between reality and horror blurs. Join me in this week's installment as we question the boundaries of what's possible and journey into the heart of our darkest fears. So brace yourselves and gather round, fellow believers, skeptics, and curious minds alike. Without further ado, let's embark on this week's gripping tale. Take a deep breath and get comfortable, for we're about to descend into the abyss. Welcome to Lady Grimm, where the paranormal comes alive. When my daughter Abby was very young, my grandmother had a stroke and died, leaving me her house in rural Alabama. It was a small house, but it was on a 4-acre property. Once all the paperwork was finalized, I moved us, me and Abby, our dog, a big lab named Charlie, and our cat Penny, from our small apartment in Houston to my grandmother's old house. It needed repairs, and I was happy to have a project to work on through the summer. I started with removing the wallpaper and updating the floors. It was a big project, and Abby would get bored and go play outside with our big lab, Charlie. The Houston apartment didn't have much outdoor space, so it was nice to see them enjoying nature. My grandmother loved tending her garden, and I could tell she had been in the middle of planting this year's seedlings when she had passed. It was nice to see Abby enjoying it now, even if she was just digging holes. I kept the doors and windows open in the house as I was doing dusty demo work, and I could hear Abby chatting away, digging her imaginary garden. One night, when I was helping her get ready for bed, she told me Great-Gran didn't like her friend. I was confused, wondering when my grandmother would have met any of her friends. I told her it was okay that Great-Gran would have liked all of her friends. I also reminded her that Great-Gran would always look out for her. She smiled and kissed me goodnight. It was around this time that Abby started talking to a friend. She was always chattering, which was fine because I could always find her and know she wasn't getting into trouble. It was when she got quiet that I worried. I found it strange that now when she talked, she'd pause as though she was listening. Sometimes she would turn and look at me after she paused, as though she was in on some big secret. I chalked it up to spending too much time alone and made a mental note that we'd have to find a park where she could spend some time with some local kids. A few days later, we did just that. The park was empty, though, so I pushed her on the swings until a woman with a little girl around Abby's age drove up. The car door opened and the little girl slid out of her seat and ran towards the playground. I heard the mom tell Kylie to be nice. Then she stayed comfortably in her air-conditioned minivan and returned to her phone call. I watched the girls playing and talking, and then I pulled out my own phone. But just a few minutes later, I looked up when I heard crying. Abby was standing on top of the playground ladder, and Kylie was crying on the ground below her. The little girl got to her feet and ran back to the minivan. I saw her close the door, and they drove away. I asked Abby what had happened, and she said, "We didn't like Kylie." I reminded Abby that she had to be nice to other kids, even if she didn't like them. She nodded and fell asleep on the way home. I assumed she was just cranky from the heat. It wasn't like her to be mean to other kids. Over the next couple of weeks, I sometimes felt like I was being watched in that house. I would be working and feel the need to look up from what I was doing because the feeling was so strong. Abby was still chattering away at her toys, and Charlie didn't even look up, so I figured it was just my imagination. One night, I had the most vivid dream of my grandmother. She was in her garden, kneeling over a hole, digging furiously, scooping deeply into the dirt and kicking back handfuls of soil. She looked panicked, pulling up handful after handful of rich brown earth. As I watched her panicking and digging, I remember trying to see what she was digging out, why she was digging so deeply. But I couldn't see over her shoulder. As I strained to look, we both fell forward into the ground. The darkness and the musty smell of dirt surrounded me as I flailed for something to grab onto. I woke up drenched in my own sweat and went to check on Abby. She was asleep, with Penny curled on the bed. The big cat opened her eyes and stretched when I looked in at them. As I closed the door to her bedroom, I glanced down the hallway towards the front of the house and saw muddy footprints on the exposed floor. A wave of panic went up my spine. But then I considered that I just had a nightmare about dirt and figured I must have tracked some in before bed, which I just hadn't noticed before. The house was a mess with repairs, so no wonder I missed it. Even so, I checked the front and back doors, which were both locked. The next day, I was preoccupied with my dream. It frustrated me because I couldn't understand it. I finally came to the conclusion that I was feeling overwhelmed by the amount of work I had been doing to the house, and nothing more. The worst part about that dream was seeing my grandmother so distraught. That was not how I wanted to remember her. I started thinking of all the times I had spent with her as a kid. She was a strong woman. All the women on my mom's side were strong, including me. I pushed the dream out of my thoughts and went looking for Abby. It was getting late and a storm was coming. Abby was at the far end of the yard, chattering. I could see her moving her little hands and arms as she talked. Charlie was asleep on the porch and didn't even look up at me. I walked out to her and saw she was digging in the dirt again. Looking over her shoulder, I froze when I saw a mound of dirt and then several deeper holes in a row, holes that were too deep for a little girl to have dug alone. I forced myself to ask her what she was doing. She looked up and smiled at me. She pointed at the dirt mound and said, "Mr. Phantom told me to bury Penny here. Then I'm going to bury Charlie tomorrow, and then you, Mommy." If you enjoyed that story, I'm glad you found me. I tell creepy stories about scary encounters and paranormal events. If this is your thing too, stay, listen, and subscribe to Lady Grimm for more stories. It's okay to keep the lights on. Let me tell you another story. For as long as I can remember, a ghost has been attached to me. When I was an only child, we moved into a new house. Well, new to us. It was an older house, like most of the houses in the part of the city where I lived. My mom was pregnant with my brother, and they needed more space. My parents weren't rich, and I remember hearing a lot of talk about working overtime to afford the new place and the new baby. My mom worked right up until my brother was born. Aiden was a quiet baby, and I remember that was good because my mom was tired a lot back then. It seemed like she was always sleeping in the first few months after Aiden was born. I was 6 at the time, And while my mom was pregnant with Aiden, my parents told me how much fun a baby brother would be. I remember going into his room and looking into his crib, and I remember thinking it was a bummer that I'd have to wait for him to get bigger before we could play. Not long after Aiden came home, about 2 months after we had moved into that new house, something happened that changed everything. I was playing in my room and I heard a tapping noise. It was a light, rhythmic sound that I almost didn't notice over my own voice as I chatted with my toys. When I did finally hear it, I stopped and looked around. I stood up and listened. The tapping was coming from my closet. I had an upstairs bedroom that had long eaves on each side, and the closet door was cut at a slanted angle. Probably because of that slant, the door had trouble staying closed. Most of the time, the door was open about an inch, revealing a dark gap. I walked over to the closet door and opened it. The tapping stopped. Behind the door, standing dead center in the small closet, was the shape of a woman. She was looking directly at me with her kind, pale face, but she wasn't completely solid. I could sort of see through her to the back of my closet. As I stood watching her, she looked down at me and grinned. I remember stepping backwards, and as I did, she disappeared. This was when I realized something was different about that woman. I had never seen her before, and at the time had never heard of ghosts, or had any concept that things could exist that were not solid, living, breathing people. I would learn about ghosts soon enough, though. I remember eating dinner that night with my mom and asking if some people were see-through. My mom was washing dishes in the sink and absent-mindedly said she didn't know. Honestly, I don't think that she even heard me. I didn't see the woman again for a few weeks. It was September, and I had just started first grade. My mom had met me at the school bus stop with Aiden, and we walked home together. I remember climbing the stairs to my bedroom and running to my open bedroom door. As I turned the corner, I heard the tapping again. But this time, the tapping was coming from the glass. As I entered the room, I saw her by the window. She was standing in front of the window, looking outside and tapping the glass with her finger. She turned as I entered, and she grinned at me. I remember just standing there, not really sure what to do. I walked in and set my backpack on my bed, with her just grinning at me. Then she reached her hand back up to the glass, tapped 3 more times, and disappeared. Again, I wasn't really afraid of her. I just didn't understand who she was and why nobody had mentioned this woman in our house before. That night, when my dad tucked me into bed, I asked him who the woman in my room was. He asked me what she looked like, and I explained to him what I'd seen and heard, and he said it sounded like I had an interesting imaginary friend. I didn't know what that meant, but since he didn't seem worried about her, I took it the way kids do when you don't blow things out of proportion. This was just another new thing to me, but was perfectly normal to everyone else. At least, until the next time I saw her. It was early one weekend morning, and I could hear my parents downstairs in the kitchen with Aiden. I ran down the stairs and reached the landing when I remembered I'd left my stuffed giraffe on my bed. I went everywhere with that thing, so I turned around to go back up the stairs, and there she was. The woman was on the stairs, tapping the banister. but this time she was coming towards me. Her face looked different. It looked distorted and longer somehow. This scared me, and I froze, just watching her there on the steps. She paused too, watching me, then disappeared. I didn't go get my giraffe until later when my mom went with me. After that, I would see her throughout the house, in different rooms and at different times of the day. She would just appear. Sometimes she would be in the same room with my parents, but I quickly learned they couldn't see her. When I'd talk about her, my parents would say I had a big imagination, and if the woman was in the room when I talked about her, she would come and stand very close to me and tap. My parents were oblivious to the tapping. She would lean in between us at dinner, tapping the table just inches away from my mother's hand, but they didn't see or feel it. I learned not to talk about her because I didn't like her getting close to me. She would hover just inches away from me, and all I could feel was a tense pressure all around me, like the feeling you have when something bad is about to happen. I felt like a mouse living with a snake that never struck. She started doing this close pressure thing right around the time Aiden started walking. There were times I would see her leaning over him, and he would fall and cry. She would grin at me and disappear. I think Aiden could see her too, because he would point in her direction sometimes. There were days when he was napping and he'd suddenly start screaming through the baby monitor. Behind his cries, I could hear the tapping, and I knew she was in his room. I wondered if she stood close to his crib, staring down over him like she did with me. When Aiden was too young to talk, I'd sometimes see him looking up at her, watching her move above my parents' heads. When he got older, he denied seeing her. He was lying, though. When she appeared, I saw his eyes dart over to her and then quickly look away. When she hovered close to him, he would close his little eyes. I think he wanted to pretend he couldn't see her so he didn't have to admit she was real. As I got older, the daily tapping continued, signaling she was nearby. It was the only noise she made, but it was horrifying. I hated waking up to her tapping. I'd open my eyes to see her floating in my bedroom just below the ceiling. She would swirl chaotically and silently and then quickly descend and hover in a corner, just watching me. Often, I'd wake in the darkest hours of the night to hear the tapping on my nightstand. I'd turn my head to see her right next to my bed, grinning. She would be very still, and I'd slowly cover my head with my blankets. I don't know how long she'd stay there, but no matter how much I'd be sweating under those blankets, I refused to pull them off of my head. Then morning would come, and she'd be gone, at least for a little while. Over time, her appearance changed. She was more menacing and dark somehow. Her movements became erratic, and she'd appear in strange and unpredictable places. Once, I went into my closet for something, and I heard the tapping. She was crouched in the corner, squatting unnaturally at the end of my row of hanging clothes. I jumped and stepped backwards out of the closet, and she disappeared. She looked more decayed, too. Her skin was peeling and sagging, and sometimes her jaw would click open wider than it should, and then snap close. She had become more demanding and cruel. If I ignored her, she would inch closer until I squealed and ran away. She seemed to like it when I was at my most scared. She would bring her grotesque face close to mine, contorting it hideously until I would close my eyes in terror. That's when she'd disappear. The worst was when she would crawl on the ceiling. She was fast, and her grinning face would turn to look at me as she crossed from the closet to the hallway and back again. The nagging feeling that she wasn't a ghost crept into my mind. Maybe she was something else entirely. But while she changed, the tapping never changed. Her daily, rhythmic tapping. Whenever I was at home, I constantly had a low-grade feeling of dread. I never knew when I'd hear the tapping and see her, and I hated being alone in the house. She would linger when I was alone, sometimes following me room to room. 3 months ago, my dad told us there was a job opening in Chicago, and he was going to take it. His mom, my Grandma Beth, lived about 45 minutes outside of the city, and I was excited to be near her. She was the type of grandma that would send us brownies or cookies for no reason and spoil us when she'd visit. She and my dad had stayed close, so I knew we'd get to spend more time with her once we moved. And even more importantly, moving meant we'd be leaving this house and my imaginary friend behind. A clean slate in a new place would have to be better than this. After years of living with this ghost, I had changed. I was jumpy and felt like I was never safe. I didn't understand why this thing wanted to scare me and why my parents couldn't see it. I wondered what she would do when we left. Would she haunt the next family or go back to whatever hell she had crawled out of? A part of me wanted her, to suffer alone once we left. When we finally drove away from that house, I felt like a huge weight had come off my shoulders. I felt like my mind was clear for the first time in 6 years. It was the first day I didn't have that building sense of dread that no matter what happened, I would have to eventually go home to that house with that dark force in it. Something that liked my terror and was good at getting what it wanted. Our new house was smaller than our old one, but it didn't matter. Any place was better than that old house. I had a basement bedroom, and my parents bought me new paint so I could make it my own. I picked turquoise, my favorite color, and we came home with brushes and rollers and 2 big cans of paint. I was so excited to get started and make my room look just like I wanted it to. As I opened the first paint can, I heard Aiden yell down the stairs. They were going to go pick up pizza and wanted to let me know. I heard the car backing out of the driveway as I unwrapped the new foam roller. I had just covered it with a layer of thick paint when I heard the sound of 3 taps against the open closet door behind me. I turned around, my heart in my throat, and saw the doorknob turn and open slowly.